this idea that, this is just sort of a natural volcanic eruption, a natural phenomenon, sounds really nice. Like, oh, it's just natural, we're going to do that. But the two things can't be further from the truth, because as the viewers know, a volcanic eruption happens and then it ends. And so then those particles fall out after some amount of time. Whereas this idea of SRM, this is a continuous input to the atmosphere. As this material drops out, you have to keep putting it there to keep this sort of sun shield, this layer there. And so really the analogy between a natural volcanic eruption and what's being proposed for SRM is not really accurate.
Greetings. I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. To mitigate the global warming crisis, several types of controversial geoengineering projects have been formulated. One of the most concerning is solar geoengineering, also known as solar radiation management, or SRM. Our guest today is an atmospheric expert who explains how solar geoengineering works and why climate scientists warn about its risks. Daniel Cziczo is a professor of atmospheric science and the former chair of the Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Department at Purdue University. His research focus is clouds and their vital role in climate, and he'll include that relationship in this discussion on solar geoengineering. Dr. Cziczo, thank you very much for joining us, and a great big welcome.
Bon, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm really excited to have this talk with you.
So first of all, in terms of geoengineering, what's the background? What's the issue that is making people look at this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to get started, we probably have to sort of jump in the Wayback Machine and just talk a little bit about what it is we're trying to fix with geoengineering, and how we've sort of gotten to this point. And so I think that, as probably most of the viewers are going to know, what we're really trying to address here is global warming, climate change. And the basics behind climate change, I think, are well known to most. That human activities, what we call anthropogenic activities, have been adding greenhouse gases, predominantly CO2, to a lesser extent methane and some other gases, to the atmosphere, warming the planet up. We know that we've warmed by at least a degree C at this point, more like a degree and a half, maybe approaching 2 now, depending on what location you're in. And so that's the impetus for this is global warming. What viewers may not know is that we are doing other things to our atmosphere at the same time as we're adding these greenhouse gases. And this is what my group and I do research on. Namely, we are adding particulate material to our atmosphere as well. And so folks, if they're in a city, headed to work today, they can think of that truck belching smoke in front of them. Wildfires have been in the news lately, wildfires which are partly because of the increased temperature of our planet, the increased aridity of our planet, increased land usage changes, things like that, leading to more burning, more particulates. And so what's interesting about this is that particles are generally considered to be a net cooler of our environment. They reflect more sunlight back to space than they trap Earth's heat. The other thing that they do, something we call an indirect effect, is those teeny particles can form the seeds of clouds. They can act as the condensation sites where water condenses or water freezes onto them. And so what I'm saying is that, as we have increased greenhouse gases, we've actually also increased particulate matter. Particulate matter is cooling the climate somewhat. It's offsetting a bit of global warming. It's not canceling it out by any means. We're still warming the planet. But this is the heart of what we're calling geoengineering, which is there are some folks that have said, well, if particles can spawn clouds, then why don't we put more particles, or why don't we make more clouds in the atmosphere? And that'll just cancel out the global warming. Of course, as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of downsides to that. We don't want to do that. We actively do not want to put particles in the atmosphere because of things like health effects, changes to precipitation, influencing droughts, influencing flooding. And we'll get into that more, but I wanted the viewers to understand that's really the heart of this is global warming. We're trying to cancel it out. there's sort of a natural thing that we're kind of playing off of here, which is this idea of particles and clouds maybe being able to reduce temperature somewhat. But there's a lot of downsides to that, as I think we'll get into over the next 30 minutes.
Exactly. And so that takes us to solar geoengineering is the popular one. And all we have to do is spray some stuff up there in the high atmosphere and everything will be cooler. But there are some problems. Can you tell us some what are they spraying? For one thing, what are a couple of things that they mean to spray that's not like these particulate things that you're talking about?
Yeah, so first off, we should just address this term geoengineering because
Yeah.
it's sort of the elephant in the room, which is a very carefully chosen word that has engineering in the title. And of course, that's a bit of a misnomer because engineering has this sort of implication to us that we're gonna do something, we're gonna figure it out, we're gonna fix a problem. And of course, at this point, that can't be further from the truth because we don't even know what the downsides of this are entirely. We know a lot of them, but geoengineering is something that we have to be very careful about using because we don't want to imply that there's a known result. So that's very often why this idea of solar radiation management has come about, which is probably a little bit closer. That we're going to try to do something, or there's proposals to try to do something. And so what are those some things? As you just pointed out, the general idea is that we're going to spray these particles in the atmosphere. They're going to be very reflective particles, and they're going to send solar radiation back into space, sunlight back into space before it makes it to the ground. There is a natural sort of precedent for this that's often referred to, and I think it's very imperfect, and we'll get into why, but people have said, oh, volcanoes, from time to time, we have an eruption. It sprays material into the upper atmosphere. This is the stratosphere. It's the layer above where we live. We live in the troposphere. The next layer up is the stratosphere. Particles that get there from things like powerful volcanic eruptions hang around for a long time. About a year is the lifetime of particles in the stratosphere. So as the thinking goes, you spray this material into the stratosphere, and it's going to sit there for a year and it's going to reflect sunlight back into space, and that's going to cool the planet below it. As I think, again, we're going to get into, there's a lot of downsides to that. That's the very simplistic answer to your question of what's being proposed, which is to put this material into the stratosphere. The second thing that you asked is, well, what's being proposed to put there? And one of the things that's been talked about is sulfuric acid. So the viewers might say, well, why sulfuric acid? The answer is that it's the natural particle that exists there. So when a volcano goes off, what does it pump into the stratosphere? It pumps sulfur dioxide, which oxidizes. It eventually chemically turns into sulfuric acid. And so at least the early proposals for this SRM idea were to just put more of that into the stratosphere. We can start getting into the downsides, which are volcanic eruptions, unfortunately, are known to deplete our ozone layer at the same time that they blot out a bit of sunlight. So here's this sort of positive that they're going to reduce the temperature a little bit, but here's also the first negative, which is even if we believe this analogy to volcanoes, which again is imperfect, we know that there's downsides of volcanic eruptions, such as ozone loss. And so that's the first thing that we should talk about. The other one is, as I'm alluding to, this idea that, this is just sort of a natural volcanic eruption, a natural phenomenon. Sounds really nice, like, oh, it's just natural, we're going to do that. But the two things can't be further from the truth, because as the viewers know, a volcanic eruption happens and then it ends. And so then those particles fall out after some amount of time. Whereas this idea of SRM, this is a continuous input to the atmosphere. As this material drops out, you have to keep putting it there to keep this sort of sun shield, this layer there. And so really the analogy between a natural volcanic eruption and what's being proposed for SRM is not really accurate.
Okay, there you brought up a number of very interesting things that have to do with this effect, and I want to really make sure we cover that ozone issue because we don't see that in the media really. Then another thing, there are two things in terms of this, the real effect of this, and I should add, I'm not sure that, I think they have to keep spraying. Like if they did do it globally, they'd have to keep it up, like every year do it all over again. which they consider not a problem, but we don't know that. And you point out the effect on ozone is a major issue. The other is what actually happens to the CO2 and methane if we keep pumping that into the atmosphere? It's still there, isn't it? And gets worse.
Yeah, no, no, no. These things are all tied together that you just brought up.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. This is generally a masking
Yeah.
effect,
Okay.
right? So what you're doing is you're trying to put up something like a sunshade, but in and of itself, that does nothing to
Right.
abate
Okay.
greenhouse gases. So those greenhouse gases are still in the atmosphere. They're still building up. Solar radiation management on its own does nothing about the emission of fossil fuels. And so what you have is the Earth system is still responding to those increased greenhouse gases. And of course, the big one is ocean acidification.
Yes.
That CO2 finds its way somewhere into our environment. A lot of it dissolves in the ocean. And so when we hear about, reef damage and marine ecosystem damage, that is not in any way addressed by solar radiation management. What's actually in a way worse is that by masking that effect, and then every year, as you said, you're putting these particles back in. As they fall out, you have to put more and more of this in. You just can imagine that if this does work to some extent, you just put more and more and more in, and you mask more and more and more of those greenhouse gases. And so that's one of the significant concerns, is that masking effect allows you to keep emitting fossil fuels, and it doesn't really do anything about these other consequences of fossil fuels that are going on.
Yes. Okay. So far, there's an impact that's very serious on ozone. And assuming we just can't band-aid that one, we can't just cure that real fast. And that's catastrophic, potentially. And another one is you mentioned the marine acidification, because you've got the CO2 into the ocean and it's getting worse and worse and worse. So that is catastrophic for the environment in general. And then you have to keep spraying this stuff. What would the actual cooling effect be? I mean, would it be significant enough to even matter?
Yeah, so the most simple answer is we don't know,
Yeah, right.
because I don't think that there is any there is no modeling study, there's no experimentation that really gives us an idea. And as I said, even when it's alluded to that there's these sort of natural effects that have gone on like a volcano, um, that is a transient. The volcano went off, and a year later, those particles are mainly gone, and so we don't really have an understanding of that. Now, we can go into that a little bit more, which are there have been some attempts to use climate models and to essentially tweak and say, okay, we're going to put some particles into this layer of the atmosphere and see what happens. There have been a lot of concerns because of those studies, because for the most part, they've been shown to be vast overestimates of what effect would actually take place. And so for the viewers, I'd like to just explain what some of those effects are, because this
Yes.
is sort of like selling a false bill of goods. So the general idea is that you put this material into the stratosphere that somehow mimics a volcano but doesn't stop, and that reflects sunlight back into space. And so when modeling studies first started looking at this and telling us what cooling would take place, one of the first things that came out of this was that people said, well, wait a minute. You have to take into account that there are already clouds below that. So when you put this material into the stratosphere, this sort of sunshade, as it were, you can't double count. You have to take into account that about a third at any one time of the planet's surface is already highly reflective because there's clouds there. Another percentage of the surface has snow or ice and would have reflected that sunlight back into space anyway. So that coverage of particles you've put into the upper atmosphere is really not as effective as a sunshade over the whole planet. It's a much smaller area than that. Beyond that, the actual efficacy of these particles that have been proposed to put there, this sulfuric acid material, for example, is not perfectly known. We have some modeling studies, but there really haven't been a lot of lab studies done to try to tune this out. So those modeling studies tend to be an overestimate. They tend to be sort of more pie in the sky than we would have liked. Another thing that we can sort of circle back to is the question that you asked earlier about ozone, because we do know that, again, these particles destroy ozone, and Mount Pinatubo went off in the 1990s, and we saw these particles make it into the stratosphere where they did chew up a considerable amount of ozone. And that's another interesting fact of some of these modeling studies, is that people have proposed to put, higher reflectivity or more inert particles there. But follow-on studies to those have almost always shown that those particles are not as reflective, or that they have side effects, that they actually are interactive with ozone, that they would deplete it, or that they would create clouds in another part of the atmosphere that could actually offset by warming. And we can talk about these so-called cirrus clouds in a few minutes.
Mhm.
But what I want to get across to the viewer again is that, these sort of studies, these very simplistic studies of a sunscreen in the stratosphere from these particles, are almost always overestimates of the effect that we could expect to have.
Okay, very quickly, another issue in there is that the experiments, and I don't know if the audience is aware of them, they have experimented with these, and it's a legal question as well whether they should, but those experiments are very limited, and do they really tell you anything about a larger scale? So a lot of things at a small scale do not come out right at the large scale. And so the issues about modeling, it seemed to fit that very well. They're not able to do it.
No, you raise another really important question with this, is that, this idea that, if you spray a bit of particles in the atmosphere, you somehow understand anything. I think that's a very false hope. And I can give you two reasons. One is that, the doing that over a small scale tells you very little about what would happen in other regions of the atmosphere, in other areas. It would give you very little information about what side effects could be at another time and at another place. So at best, it would be more of an engineering test. And I think that the real downside to this is a normalization, that, once you do a small scale, then you move to medium scale, and then you move to large scale before you really know what you're doing. But I think, the other thing that you were getting at is the scale of this. We really wouldn't know what the effect was until many years into the future. And again, this gets at this idea that it's not a volcanic eruption that we're mimicking. There could be an effect in the atmosphere, a radiative effect or a chemical effect, that wouldn't be revealed until these particles had existed there and reached some kind of an equilibrium, 1, 2, 3 years into the future. And I think that's a great fear for a lot of folks. One of the so-called unknown unknowns of if we were to try something like this.
Yes. And so thank you for that, because there's two things: that the modeling has not really been very accurate, or it can't be, possibly because it's extremely complex. The climate is a very complex system, and we're talking global, and that complicates things too. And then small scale does not tell you anything really about large scale. And so that leads us, I think, to why a lot of climate scientists are very concerned about this. Could you elaborate for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is an interesting topic, because of course there's a lot of very vocal proponents of this
Right.
idea. And again, I hope that I've made the case that a lot of that is very oversimplified, and that a lot of those sort of estimates of what effect this would have are probably, again, overstated. And then on the other side, you probably have a less vocal large group, probably I would dare say a vast majority of scientists, who are very scared about this. And so we've already touched on one, which is destruction of the ozone layer. We're just coming out of an age where chlorofluorocarbons had a very deleterious effect on the ozone layer. We've sort of figured that out, put protocols in place, regulations to counter that. The idea that you would then knowingly go back and do something is very, very scary. And so that is certainly one that hasn't been addressed to anybody's satisfaction, I think. Another one is the uncertainty behind this. And I mentioned at the very get-go that, we've got this idea of global warming. We know about greenhouse gases. The science behind that is actually quite old. It dates back to the mid 1800s. But the addition of particles and this indirect formation of clouds, is much newer. It's, maybe some decades old. And it's generally thought to be the largest uncertainty in our climate system right now. And it's one of the reasons that I do this research is that, how are changes in particles affecting climate? How do they affect our atmospheric chemistry? How do the clouds that are spawned affect our climate? And how do they affect our atmospheric chemistry? What is maddening for somebody like me, where I study this and I have to deal with the uncertainty every day, is that the whole idea that we're talking about behind solar radiation management is to take possibly the most uncertain thing about our climate system and somehow use that to tune out warming. So the warming is well understood. The abundance of greenhouse gases is well understood. And somehow we're going to take this other thing that we admit we don't know very well, and we're going to use that as a fine tuning agent. That to me makes absolutely no logical sense. And then there are other things that we've kind of touched on. Clouds, as everybody knows, are the source of precipitation. So if you're going to change something about particles and those particles spawn clouds, by definition, you are going to change something about precipitation. And so even though you put these particles into the stratosphere, they do have to fall out. They do have to find their way into the lower part of the atmosphere where they're going to participate in this cycle. And we just simply don't know how that is going to happen. There, again, are some very rudimentary modeling studies, but no real information on that. And then finally, there are other things that we need to be concerned with, which is if you're going to, in some way, blot out some sunlight or reflect some sunlight back into space. Well, sunlight is important for a number of things. One of them is plant life on the surface. There are a few studies that have looked at how diffuse radiation, like during a volcanic eruption, affects plants. Not surprisingly, there are some studies that say, oh, certain plant types might grow better with diffuse radiation. There are also studies that say other plant types grow worse. These are not really comprehensive studies. I don't believe there are studies that are comprehensive to all crop types or all locations, especially in a climate that would also have CO2 ramping up and other changes going on. And so that is a terrifying prospect, that we could be changing something about plant life on the surface and the crops that we're relying on. The other thing for the astute viewers, and then I'll turn it back to you, is that, one of the alternative technologies that we have to fossil fuels is solar energy production. And so if you're blotting out some amount of sunlight, you're cutting into your margins on that as well. And so that's also kind of terrifying, that you're sort of hamstringing one of the alternate technologies to get you off of fossil fuels in a way that we probably don't fully understand. And again, possibly ramping this up at the same time as we're needing more and more of the power generated from solar cells, for example, or from direct solar, if the viewers are aware of that. So yeah, I think those are kind of the top several concerns. There's certainly others that we can think of. I'm sure the viewers can think of yet more, but those are kind of the top ones that really concern us as scientists.
Right. Do you know, just very quickly on the clouds, I think one time you mentioned that the clouds differ in chemistry a lot today because of the stuff we're putting out there. And what would that, might that affect things? You mentioned the sulfur stuff coming down from up high, changing these things. We depend on clouds. We never hear about that. And so you're adding some real different chemistry to these clouds. Anything that scares you to death about that, or?
Yeah, a lot of this scares me quite a bit, as you can probably tell from this conversation. No, thank you for bringing that up, because this is one of our areas of specialty, which is how are humans influencing, and how we have since industrial days influenced clouds. One of the interesting things about this is, as this material falls down into the upper part of our layer of the atmosphere, the upper troposphere, that's where cirrus clouds exist. And so the viewers can think these are the sort of thin, wispy clouds that you see on an otherwise clear day. Cirrus clouds are almost unique in our climate system in that they're actually a global warming agent.
Oh.
And so this sounds kind of weird, right? Because clouds are generally reflective. You think of them reflecting sunlight back. But cirrus clouds, because they sit at the very top of the troposphere and they're very cold, actually have this almost unique property where they absorb and re-radiate more of the terrestrial of the heat. They act more like a blanket than they do a sunshade. And so what's very interesting about this, and I think there's been a growing amount of work in this is that as these particles fall out, especially if some of these weird, unique particles that people are theorizing might be more reflective but less detrimental to ozone, a side effect of those particles looks to be that they could actually increase Cirrus coverage, which again would warm. So you're trying to reflect sunlight, but a consequence of those particles falling out is that you create this blanket underneath, and you could actually offset a good deal of the cooling that you would have going on. And so yeah, that's another interesting but also scary side effect of what's being
Right.
proposed.
And presumably you can't just blow those clouds away as that as they start.
No, now we need another technology that we're going to create a
Another
new cloud.
model and
Yeah.
everything else. Everything else. That is such valuable information about the clouds. Now I see why you're always up in the air getting these particles and stuff. But thank you, because we just don't get that information, and we need it. And these people advertising for solar geoengineering do not mention this. So anyway, one more thing, Dan, before we shift off to the questions, is that there are people in the geoengineering camp that say, well, this is temporary. We have to do something right now because we can't shift immediately to renewables. But then there are a whole lot of people in the renewable camp that say, oh, yes, we can. And they bring a lot of evidence out to that effect. Could you comment on that, please? Do you think we have to delay, or?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I can certainly answer, from the standpoint of the science that we understand. And so, what I would say is that I think the common argument that we hear is that we're gonna reach some temperature that we just absolutely have to intervene. And so I think my response to that would be that, all of these side effects that we've already talked about, how does somebody weigh a temperature increase versus the side effect? And one thing we've talked about before is that it's a tragedy that there are heat deaths going on, that an increase in temperature kills people. At the same time, if you intervene and you have some destruction of the ozone layer, then presumably, just as we saw the last time we were destroying ozone, there's going to be an increase in skin cancer and skin cancer deaths. And how anybody would weigh those two things, I have no idea. What I do see is that, there are solutions to this. Sequestration of carbon, finding ways to draw that carbon out of the atmosphere. I'm not naive, we can't shut off fossil fuel tomorrow and suddenly go to renewables, but speeding up that transition is certainly another one of the options. As a scientist, pulling the carbon out is a path that we know. It's a much more certain future because it's looking back into the past when we had lower and lower carbon, going back to pre-industrial times. Transitioning more quickly to alternate technologies. I mean, I do understand, again, not being naive, that there is a cost to that, but that's a much more certain future without these significant side effects and risks that we've talked about. And so I think that's my answer to your question, is that, if we're going to do this, we are much better taking the path that has a lot more certainty, has less risk, has less of these unknown unknowns, because that's the really terrifying stuff here.
Okay, I thank you very much for all that great information. And I think we should go to the questions, if that's okay. One of them is, let's see, at the top. Who makes decisions about which elements they're going to put in the Earth's atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's probably as many answers as there are proponents of these geoengineering techniques. And so, this sort of dates back to a paper by Paul Crutzen, who's a rather famous scientist, a Nobel Prize winner. And I think he was even sort of expounding off of earlier work. There was I believe a Russian scientist that had proposed the first use of sulfur dioxide mimicking these volcanic eruptions. And so that dates back, 20 some odd years now. Since that time, there have been a number of other proponents of geoengineering that have brought up, higher reflectivity particles or particles that they believe in some way would be inert to ozone loss. Again, those things have kind of been debunked. So we find that there's side effects to the reflective particles doing other things. We found, these so-called inert particles are not actually inert. But yeah, there's a whole host of different materials from sulfuric acid to calcium carbonate to diamond dust that
Yeah.
would be put into the stratosphere.
And none of it is really well understood. Okay, thank you very much for that. And then very quickly, I think we talked about this a little bit, but how would the incoming sunlight reduction affect photosynthesis?
Yeah, so we did touch on that, and I think that the quick answer to it is it's not known. Of course, there's agricultural agronomy folks that could probably answer this better. I know that there's been a few studies of diffuse radiation effects on plants, but I don't believe it's been comprehensive, and I don't believe that it's sort of covered the entire range of what you would get out of some of these solar radiation management proposals. Again, there are some plant types that are believed to thrive in diffuse radiation like you would have if you were reflecting sunlight. But there are others that do need that sort of direct beam of sunlight that are going to be adversely impacted. And how that globally, affects crop yields, I think it's a big unknown.
Another question, when will the tests happen? And we talked about that there had been some, but go ahead if you will. And I don't know if you could comment about the legal issues with that occurred. Okay.
Yeah. Again, I'm a scientist. I'm not a
Yeah.
policy person. I know in no way, decide these kind of things. My understanding is that there were proposals for some small scale tests, and there was a governing body that did overrule that and said that there were just too many side effects, too many consequences, too much of a slippery slope. I think that generally the viewers should know that there are governing bodies, the UN, of course.
Yes.
There are prohibitions on doing unilateral spraying of stuff in the atmosphere, and they can think of all the reasons why that would be the case. And I don't believe anybody has sort of signed off. I think one of the scary things here is the so-called rogue player that a very rich person or a country that wanted some climate sort of change might just do it on their own. And I think that's one of the scary things. And it borders on some of these tests and actual deployment that you could have a so-called rogue player do this. At this point in time, I don't think that this is something that we're going to see happen, that there's going to be a deployment. Although there are a lot of vocal proponents of it, and the scary part would be that we sort of jump into deployment before the science is really understood.
Exactly. And maybe that a lot of politicians don't understand the science and they say, okay, that's a good idea. But by the way, I believe that the UN has definitely come out opposing this because it's too dangerous and it's imposing on people's atmospheres, the national atmospheres. Okay. I don't know if you can answer this one or feel comfortable with this. At Woods Hole institution, the scientists are looking at fertilizing the ocean with iron, and that's to reduce the CO2. What do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I'm not a marine
Yeah,
biologist by
right.
any means, so I have to be very careful to tread on this.
Yes.
Just for the education of the viewers. So the general idea here is that you would spread some type of material on the ocean. Iron has been mentioned, and actually there was a deployment a number of years ago that tried to do this. And the idea would be that you stimulate life, that you have a so-called bloom, and what that material would be photosynthetic, and it would suck up some amount of CO2, and then when it died, it would fall out and sequester that material. I know there are a number of downsides to this. Not fully understanding exactly what you needed to fertilize. Would you just be dumping material, but you would miss some critical component? Once that material fell out, is it really truly sequestered and taken out of the Earth system? So again, I would say that this is something that a marine biologist, sort of a marine chemist would have to really discuss more than me. But that's the general idea there. It's considered to be kind of a carbon sequestration offshoot, but I think one that has a lot of uncertainties that go along with it.
Right. I'm going to rephrase this a little, that you talked about this a little bit anyway, but what about the risks of deploying solar geoengineering compared to not doing anything about this? Do you see which is the greater risk?
Oh, I mean, I think, as a lot of folks have pointed out, the future is still to be written, and so, I don't know that this is an and or sort of decision. Like, it's not that the only way to deal with climate change is solar radiation management. And Yvonne, if I've mistaken the question, please let me know. But this idea that, oh, this is our only way of reducing temperature is that's a false statement. As I think we've tried to lay out here, this idea that there are means, and certainly future research is needed. There are means to start changing our technology over to stop putting as many greenhouse gases in. There are also a lot of ideas for how to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, because at some point we probably are going to need to pull CO2 downward. But doing research in this area with all of these risks and side effects that we've talked about versus trying to extract CO2 and making that our future, that's an easy choice for me, just looking at this from a logical perspective.
Right. And I think that underscores the alarm of the climate scientists, the bulk of the climate scientists. I think you mentioned that too. The bulk of climate scientists are really alarmed about this. They're not just saying no, they're alarmed about using it at all. What is the most important finding your team has made to help us better understand how we could deter climate change? Is that within your research?
Yeah, I'll say that that's not really what our
Yeah.
area is right now. But let me explain. What we're trying to understand right now is the impact that particles and clouds are having on our climate system, because generally speaking, this is considered to be the largest uncertainty again in the climate system. And so that's not sort of a finding that helps us reduce global warming. What instead we're trying to do is that as we project futures of climate change, we need them to be certain. We need to know if we do X, the result is Y. And so reducing uncertainty helps us to do that. In other words, if we can tell you that some particle is going to have a detrimental impact on our climate system, it's going to lead to these cirrus clouds that are going to warm, or that it's going to have an effect on precipitation or something like that. That's what we would really like to know. That's what we're trying to figure out at this point in time. It happens to overlap with some of these proposals that are coming out in so-called SRM, because it allows us to say, there's really a lot more uncertainty here than the proponents are saying. And that's I think, maybe our impact right now.
Right. And one more, that there's a question here about how this might affect solar panels for energy. Do you have anything else to add to that, or could you explain again that?
Yeah, no. Certainly, this is one of the side effects, and so I mentioned this direct beam idea, and I should probably go into that a little bit more, because it's not solar panels. So folks have probably seen this idea where solar power is collected and then concentrated onto a source, and then power can, for example, be generated once you collect a large amount of that solar energy into a spot. And so there have been papers in the past that show that the margins on that are really greatly reduced, maybe even making it not a viable technology if you were to also deploy these sort of stratospheric solar radiation management ideas. Solar panels, though, of course, the margin on those is going to go down, and it's going to depend on how much of this material is put into the stratosphere. So whatever percent of sunlight being radiated back to space or reflected back into space is not going to make it down. So any solar panel that's below that is going to drop its effectiveness by that much amount of power. And so yeah, the viewer should keep that in mind, is that you again are really cutting into the margins on all of these sort of replacement technologies that involve solar energy.
Right. You've really underscored some very important things about this, and the uncertainty is a big one here, that they really do not know what can really happen with this. And there's a lot of money going in this research, and maybe people who are not climate scientists certainly are involved in it in a big way. But in any case, we appreciate your input here very much. I hope you and your colleagues around the world, and you've done this work all around the world, I hope that you will speak up, because we need to hear from the experts, and you're a very good explainer too. So, listen, thank you very much, Dr. Cziczo, for this great information today. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And certainly we will keep doing events like this. And thank you for getting
Absolutely.
this out there and helping people understand this very important topic.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.